Sanhedrin Daf Yomi Sanhedrin, Cruelty and Brutality. We're dealing with the sugya of mitzamtzem beretzicha, a case where you're not murdering somebody with an act of murder, but you're constricting his access to life. And to what extent is that an act of murder, and how does that work? And in learning this piece of Gemara, what we learn is the subtle, the apparently subtle, although once we understand it, not so subtle difference between cruelty and brutality. We've had some very difficult weeks here in Eretz Yisrael, and one of the most difficult ones, that emotionally difficult, although intellectually we kind of knew that the Beaverses had not survived. So when we got the news that their bodies were returned, it was just the stark reality of it, but it wasn't as if we were really expecting them to come out alive at that particular time. And yet it was so very, very difficult for us to deal with. And part of the difficulty was the comment that came after the forensic study, where the comment was, they weren't killed by Israeli rockets or collapses of buildings. They were killed with the bare hands of the terrorists. And that phrase, being killed with the bare hands, is what made it very difficult. And I was thinking to myself at the time and subsequently, why does it really make that much of a difference if they were killed with the bare hands, or they were killed with a knife, or they were killed by being shot at? Are we dealing with these differences? Why did we find that image particularly difficult to handle? And that's the subject of what this piece of Gemara is. The Mishnah says on the bottom of Ayin Vov Amud Beis, Ve'elu haneheragin. These are the people whose death sentence is hereg. They're killed with a sword or a guillotine. And one of them is harotzeach, a murderer. And one of the cases of murder is rotzeach shikayet re'ehu be'even or bevarzel. One is where he kills his friend using an implement, a stone or an iron implement. That's a case of retzach. But also a case of retzicha is v'kavash alav l'toch hamayim. If you drowned him in the water, you held him underwater until he couldn't breathe anymore. Or l'toch ha'or, you held him in a fire. So you're not using an implement, but you're putting him into the situation of death. Ve'enu yachol la'alot misham, in the situation where he can't escape from that. V'amet, and he dies there. Chayav, that's a guilty of capital offense. Asks the Gemara, Kavash minal, and where do we know this from? What's the Gemara's question? Why should that be so difficult to figure out? Clearly, because we've got a principle of Groma ben Ezekin, and we see the Gemara deals with the fact that Groma applies here to that when damage is not direct, it's indirect. Beis Din can't deal with it. If A damages B in an indirect way, the Beis Din can't evaluate what exactly has happened here and what the intention was, or wasn't their intention, and we say chayav b'dinei shamayim. Beis Din can't give a punishment, but shamayim, Hashem takes care of people who damage one another indirectly rather than directly. So here too, holding somebody's head underwater, maybe that's indirect damage. I didn't kill him; he drowned. I made it difficult for him to get up, that's true, but I didn't do there wasn't an act of retzicha. Maybe it's groma. Says the Gemara, Omar Shmuel, the Amar Kra o be'eva. The Pasuk says, if he comes with hatred, l'rabot et hamitzamtzem. That includes somebody who constricts the life of others. Now we're going to see on Daf Ayin Zayin that there are many exceptions to that. And we'll look at some of the exceptions this morning, that there are. So how does the Pasuk work? Yes, it says, Be'eva, if he comes with hatred and kills his friend. So you see, what's important is the hatred. It's not whether it was direct or indirect. It's whether it was with hatred. But we'll see cases where it was hatred and it is considered indirect, Ritzicha. How does it actually work? This is a very good example of when the Gemara quotes a Pasuk. It's important to open the Chumash and read the whole Pasuk, because the Gemara assumes you know the Pasuk. In this case, as we'll see, everything changes when you see the Pasuk. The Gemara says, Shmuel says, the Amar Kra or Be'eva, if he comes with hatred. L'rabot et hamitzamtzem, even if he's merely constricts life, he doesn't murder, but it's done with hatred, that too is called Ritzicha. But if you read the Pasuk, it's O Be'eva hikahu ve'yado. if he killed him with his hands, if he killed him in hatred with his hands, as I looked at this pasuk, I just thought of that Biba situation. So with your hand, why is that so important? That's the difference. That it was done with your bare hands, that's what's important. Although that's not what the Gemara, if you just look in the Gemara, it doesn't quote that part of the pasuk. But if you read the whole pasuk, both words are important, Eva and Biyado. And without the Netziv, I struggled so much with this piece of Gemara, as you'll see as we go through it, until I learned the Netziv on the pasuk. And with the Netziv, it becomes completely clear. It says the Netziv, Eva eino ela belev ve'eino yadua lezulato. The Torah says if he comes to him with hatred, then it's ritzicha. How do you know if it was hatred or not? How do you know what was going on in his heart? Sometimes you can tell, but sometimes you can't tell, particularly when the damage is indirect. He could say we were kidding around, we were ducking each other under the water. I didn't know he was going to run short of breath. It doesn't necessarily come from a place of hatred. How is Beis Din going to determine there was hatred? Says that Netziv, Ach ba'asher hikahu biyado, nikar shehaita eva tmuna belibo. It's because he used his bare hands. That shows you there was hatred. A person kills somebody from a distance with a gun, a person uses an implement, it's a little bit more surgical. A person uses his bare hands to throttle somebody, to kill somebody, that's not cruelty, that's brutality. There's hatred. Says the Netziv, the biyado is megale on the eva. When it says the biyado manifests the hatred. The fact that you're using your hands, and it's so interesting. I think to myself, if we hadn't had this terrible time of dealing with the emotional hardships of the Bibas family, particularly everything that's been going on, but if I hadn't reflected on the biyado, why are they telling us they murdered them with their hands? Why is that significant? And yeah, the Netziv answers it. The Netziv explains why that's really significant. Because that shows brutality rooted in a terrible hatred. That's not just you arguing and in occupied territories and these were ex-soldiers. No, none of that. Not when you use your hands. When you use your hands, this is just sin'ah. This is just terrible hatred. Even if you never knew that they had a difficulty in their relationship, you might have thought they were two friends. But if the one murders the other with his bare hands, you know that there was hatred all the time in that relationship. So that's really important in understanding the Gemara. And the Rambam codifies it, if you push somebody into the water, or into a fire, and he can't escape from there, or you dunk him into the sea and hold him underwater, or all these cases, even if you didn't put him into the water, he was in the water already, you just held him in the water, you didn't let him come up for air. That also is Ritzicha b'chol elu neherag alav shezeh kamo shechanako biyado. Even though there's a bit of a time lapse, you didn't actually put him into the situation. You didn't push him into the water. Nevertheless, you held him there, and that's like strangling him. You strangulated him. You deprived him of air. You can say when a person strangles another person, also, I'm just strangling him. He didn't have to die. Yes, but you're depriving him of his source of life, and therefore he dies. Says the Rambam, that's strangulation, and it's murder. Fine. Rava then goes on Daf Yomi Sanhedrin, and Rava says, "Kefato umet bera'av." So I understand you hold him underwater, he can't breathe, that's murder. What happens if you lock him into a room without food? Is that murder too? It would seem yes. What's that different? You're depriving him of a source of life. Says Rava, no, he's potu. That is not murder. That doesn't mean midei shamayim, of course, but it's not murder. It's not direct murder for which there's capital offense. Ve'omar Rava, and Rava went further and said the following: Kefato bechama v'met. What happens if it's a very hot day and you lock him up in an iron shed that he can't come out, and it's hot and it's getting hotter and hotter, and he dies? But see now, it's terribly cold and you lock him up in a refrigerator, and he dies. Umet, chayav. For that you chayav. That is death. That is like holding him underwater. However, sof chama lavo. if at the time you locked him in the iron shed, it wasn't hot yet, but you know it's going to get hot. And later on the sun comes and it's midday and it's terribly hot and he dies of dehydration. Soft sina lavo, or it's not yet cold, but it's going to get cold in the night. Potter. In those cases, is potter. So one can deal with the differences between holding him underwater and depriving him of food and air and water and so on. But what's really interesting is the Rambam and the Ran. The Rambam, on the next page, says, if you tie somebody up and deprive him of food and he dies of hunger, that's one case. Or you put him in a place where ultimately the sun would come. It's not hot yet, but it's going to get hot. In all these cases, Beis Din cannot give him the death sentence, even though he is a murderer. And Hashem, the Doresh Damim, Hashem, who demands accountability for murder, will deal with him. Beis Din can't do that because, as the Rambam holds, this is Groma. So the Rambam puts all of Rava's cases, or the two of Rava's cases together. If you tie him up and in a way that he can't access food, or you put him in a place where it will become hot later on, there, in that situation, that is Grama. Asks the Ran, why then does Rava give us both dinim? Rava gave us three cases. Two of them seem to be a repetition. The one case is you put him there when it's hot. You lock him up in the iron shed and it's already very hot. That's murder. But if you put him in the iron shed and it will become hot later on, that is groma, that is indirect murder. And Rava also taught us that if you put him into a place and there's no food and you lock the door and he can't access food, that is not murder, that is groma. What is the difference between the two groma cases, which the Rambam classifies together in one? If they're the same, if they are both indirect, I just locked him up in a room. Then I walked away, I threw the key away. That's all I did. And then he died of starvation. I'm sorry he wasn't fat enough to be able to survive on his fat until somebody could have saved him. It wasn't my fault. Or I locked him up in a place. When I locked him up, it was cool. It became hot later on. I'm sorry nobody came to save him before the heat came up. In both these cases, that's indirect damage. Ask the Ran, what's the difference between the two? And the Ran, I bring it in the footnote, goes on and makes a kind of a difference, not a very strong difference. The Yad Ramah makes a stronger difference. But Rashi is very stark in the way he does it. And Rashi says, in the first case, כפתו ומת ברעב, where you lock him up in a room and he dies of starvation. דבשעה שכפתו אין כאן דבר הריגה. Those words are crucially important. The instrument of death is not present. I'm locking him up in the room and there is no instrument of death. There is no sun, there is no cold, there's nothing. It's just a room. And the hunger comes and gets stronger and stronger. And it's not like constricting a person underwater. The instrument of death is there, the water, the fire is going to kill him. And it's present and you see it. However, if I block him up in a place at a time when it's not yet hot, and I put him in this iron shed, it's in the middle of the night, it's cool, it's comfortable, he's got a nice bed to sit on, I give him a TV to watch, everything's good. But I lock it up and I take away the key, and I know it's going to get hot and he's not going to be able to survive the heat. In that case, he's patur. Isn't that the same as the hunger? I know he's going to die, patur. Still, a Beit Din cannot execute him. God has to take care of that. Look at Rashi's lashon, look at Rashi's language carefully. Here, the agent of death was not available for the death, for the killing. What is the agent of death? The sun. It's going to come up, but not yet. It's not ready yet, but it's there. Nevertheless, that's grama. Ve'en dino masur lebeit din ela l'shamayim. And heaven has to deal with him. A court of law can't deal with him. So what we need to understand is the subtle difference in the Rashi between the case, in order to answer the Ran's question and to understand the difference between Rashi and the Rambam, we have to understand the subtle difference that Rashi introduces us to between Ein kan dvar hariga. There is no instrument of death. He dies because of his lack of inner resources. If you do a post-mortem afterwards, if you know nothing of the facts, and you say, how did this person die? The post-mortem would say he died of hunger. But if you look at the case of locking him up in the sun, you'll say he died of heat. There is an external source of death. Something killed him. Heat killed him. Cold killed him. In the first case, what killed him? He didn't have food. He died of hunger. Nothing killed him. He died. In one case, he died. In the other case, he was killed. So there are three cases. The one is, I killed him. The second one is, he was killed by something I did. And the third one was, he died. I facilitated his death, but he died. He wasn't killed. There's the difference. So why is there such a difference? Why is it necessary for Rava to even explain that difference to us? And for that, again, we need to go back to understanding the Nitziv. The difference is, to what degree is this biyado? To what degree are you killing him with your bare hands, which reveals a deep-seated hatred that makes it guilty of a capital offense? In the case where it's very hot in the middle of the day, I lock him in the iron shed, that's murder. That's like holding him underwater. That's murder. I can feel the heat. I know it's hot. He can feel the heat. As I'm locking him up, he's feeling the desperateness of the situation, and it just gets worse and worse, and he dies. That's one case of brutality. What about when I lock him up? There's no sun yet. It's still calm, and I've given him a couch to sit on and a TV to watch, and everything's comfortable. It's very cruel because I know what's going to happen. Cruelty is in your head. You can be cruel in your mind because you know what it's going to lead to. That can be cruelty. Even at the time of doing it, you're smiling and you're courteous, like the Nazis were while they were dealing with their death machinery. You can be efficient, you can be courteous, you can be distant. There's no brutality in the moment. In the moment, everything looks comfortable. It becomes deathly later on, but then I'm not there. I'm nowhere to be found. I'm not watching it. It's not with my hands. And therefore, it's groma. But still, the sun is there. I can see the sun coming up. I know the sun's coming up. There's a little brutality. But in the first case, ein kan devar hariga, there actually isn't an instrument of death at all. There is, in that situation, it's terribly cruel, but it's not brutal. And it doesn't fit into the category of the posuk of im be'eva hikahu v'yado. That is not called biyado. That is less of biyado. So Rashi teaches us that in Rava's three cases, there's a gradation of cruelty. The case of absolute cruelty is you lock him up in the iron shed in the sun, in the heat. Groma, indirect, is you lock him up in the iron shed, seeing the heat about to come, but it's not yet there. That's more brutal. But it's not brutal enough to be called biyado. And then depriving him of food is the least brutal way of all. And we've seen in these very difficult times that we've seen cruelty, and we know about cruelty. This is something that as the Jewish nation we've suffered at the hands of cruelty. We know what cruelty looks like. We know exactly what cruelty looks like, and it's a terrible thing. But what we're dealing with over the last year and a half is not cruelty. We're dealing with a brutality. Starting on October the 7th all the way through, we're dealing with biyodayim. There is such deep-seated hatred that it's with yodayim. You're using a situation here as im be'eva, as the Pasuk says, hikahu ve'yado. This is worse than killing him with a stone in the earlier psukim, or killing him with an iron instrument. What's the difference? You're killing him. What's the difference whether you used an instrument or you used your hands? The difference is in the brutality and the deep-seatedness of the hatred that exists when the hands are used. And that's the nature of the enemy that we're dealing with. And Mirza Hashem, may there come an end not only to the brutality but also to the cruelty, and that we come in the month of Adar into a time where the Jewish people will again not only feel the lack of cruelty. Haman is we see the cruelty of of Haman. That was cruelty. It wasn't so much brutality. It was cruelty. But we've had cases in more recent history where it's not just cruelty, where it's brutality. It's biyodayim. It's nikar shehaita evat muna belibo. There is such deep-seated hatred, and when the hatred is so deep-seated, there's no negotiation. When it's so deep-seated, there's no two states. There's no living together in peace afterwards. That you can do with cruelty. You can get over cruelty, but you can't get over the kind of hatred which is manifested and expressed in the brutality of murdering with bare hands.